Assalamu alaikum and good morning. In recent years, macroeconomic stability across Southeast Asia has been severely tested by global supply shocks and volatility commodity markets. Understanding how individual nations navigate this pressure is critical to analyze the economic future of the regions. For our assessment today, our group is presenting a comprehensive analysis titled Comparing Inflation in Selected Asian Countries. And my name is Muhammad Fikri, and I am joined by my research team Muhammad Sazwan, Muhammad Ikram Haikal, Muhammad Harith Aldani, Wan Suhaila Farhawani, and Nur Shazwani. Our ultimate objective is to provide a comprehensive data-driven synthesis of economics resilience in Asian blocs. And now, I will pass the floor to Harith Aldani to explain for more details.
Good day to my lecturer and fellow classmates. Today I am going to present my assignment titled Comparing Inflation in Selected Asian Countries. Inflation is a critical economic indicator that heavily affects our daily life, and understanding how different neighboring countries cope with it gives us valuable economic insight. To understand the current situation, let's look at the background. Following the COVID-19 pandemic, the world faced severe global inflation. This was primarily caused by major disruption in global supply chains, increased shipping costs, and geopolitical conflicts like the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, which sent oil and food prices skyrocketing. Because Asian countries heavily depend on international trade, they felt the direct impact of this global spike, an effect often referred to as imported inflation. However, the impact was not uniform. It varied across countries due to divergent economic structures and different government interventions. Let's compare how different countries responded. First, let's look at Malaysia and Indonesia. Both of these nations managed to keep their core inflation relatively insulated during the global peaks. They achieved this by heavily relying on administrative measures such as strict domestic subsidies, particularly for fuel and energy, as well as implementing price ceiling on essential food items. On the other hand, Singapore and the Philippines had very different experiences. Singapore imports almost everything, so they did not utilize subsidies. Instead, their central bank focused on strengthening the Singapore dollar (SGD) to make importing goods cheaper. Meanwhile, the Philippines suffered from high inflation, mainly due to severe weather conditions. Phenomena like El Nino destroyed local crops, which caused food prices, especially rice, to become very expensive. Where do we stand now? According to recent data from the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the Asian Trade Macroeconomic Research Office (AMRO), inflation across Asian 5 economies has entered a cooling phase. It is now stabilizing within a manageable range of 2.5% to 3.3%. This deceleration shows the lagging effect of synchronized monetary policy tightening executed by our regional central bank to anchor long-term inflationary expectations. First, it allows us to evaluate monetary policy effectiveness. We can learn whether changing interest rates like Malaysia does or manipulating currency value like Singapore does works better to control inflation. Second, it helps in analyzing the cost of living and consumer purchasing power. Inflation directly impacts daily expenses, and this study helps us see how price increases affect consumers in developing nations compared to high-income nations. Third, this topic is crucial for assessing regional trade competitiveness. If a country suffers from very high inflation, its local products become more expensive to produce, making them harder to sell to other Asian neighbors. This study helped identify which country remains competitive in trade. Lastly, it acts as a guide for foreign direct investment (FDI) decisions. Investors avoid countries with unstable prices. By comparing inflation rates, we can understand why certain Asian countries look safer and more attractive to foreign businesses than others. In conclusion, comparing inflation across selected Asian countries reveals that while global challenges affect us all, individual domestic policies and economic structures dictate how well a country survives the storm. Thank you very much for listening.
Assalamualaikum and hello to madam. My name is Muhammad Shazwan bin Hamdan. So today, I would like to present for my part which are definition of inflation, theory of inflation, types of inflation, and countries selected for our study. Inflation. Inflation is a situation where the general price of goods and services increase continuously over a period of time. When an inflation occurs, consumers need to spend more money to purchase the same goods and services. For example, the price of goods, transportation, and other daily necessities become more expensive. Besides that, inflation increases the cost of living and reduce purchasing power. Purchasing power refers to the ability of consumers to buy goods and services with the money they have. When price rise, the same amount of money can buy fewer goods and services than before. As a result, consumers may need to spend more money to maintain their standard of living or choose cheaper alternatives. In addition, there is a negative relationship between inflation and the value of money. This means that when inflation increases, the value of money decreases because it can purchase favor goods and services. There are two main theories of inflation. The first is the Keynesian theory. According to this theory, inflation occurs when the aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply. In other words, consumer, businesses, and the government spend more than the economy can produce, causing price to rise. Keynesian economists believe that inflation can be controlled through government policy, such as taxation, government spending, and interest rate adjustment. The second theory is the classical theory. This theory is based on quantity theory of money, which state that inflation occurs when the money supply grows faster than the production of goods and services. When there is too much money circulating in the economy, but output does not increase at the same rate, price will rise. Therefore, classical economists believe that controlling the money supply is important to maintain price stability. To summarize, inflation increases the cost of living and reduce purchasing power. The Keynesian theory explains the inflation from the demand side, while the classical theory explains inflation from the money supply side. Moving on to the second slide, I will explain the two main types of inflation, which are demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Firstly, demand pull inflation occurs when the aggregate demand in the economy exceeds aggregate supply. This happens when consumer spending, business investment, and government expenditure increase significantly. When the economy is operating near full employment, firms cannot easily increase production, so they respond by increasing price. As a result, the general price level rise and the purchasing power of money decrease. To control demand pull inflation, the government can reduce spending or increase tax to lower aggregate demand. In addition, the central bank can increase interest rates and reduce the money supply to discourage borrowing and spending. Secondly, cost push inflation. Cost push inflation occurs when the cost of production increase. This may be caused by higher wage, rising raw material price, or increasing energy costs. To maintain their profit margin, firms pass this higher cost on to consumer through higher price. As production costs continue to rise, business may reduce output, leading to decrease in the aggregate supply and further increase in the price. Cost push inflation can be controlled through measures such as stabilizing raw material and energy price, providing subsidy, or implementing wage control policy. Next, our study focused on 5 ASEAN countries, namely Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam. These countries were selected because they are among the major drivers of economic growth in the Southeast Asia. They also have different economic structure, policy approach, and level of exposure to global economic shock, which influence inflation trends. Therefore, comparing these countries allows us to better understand inflation behavior and evaluate how different monetary and fiscal policy are used to control inflation. That's all for my part. Thank you.
Good afternoon, my lecturer and team members. My name is Suhaila Farhawan Betulullah. Today I will present on the topic inflation trends and inflation analysis in the Asian region. As shown in the chart, Asian countries have experienced 3 major inflation waves over the past 5 years. This shows that inflation is dynamic and influenced by global economic, political, and environmental factors. So, what are these trends and what do they tell us about the economy? Trend 1, post-pandemic and research. The first inflation wave occurred between 2021 and 2023 after the COVID pandemic. During this period, economies reopened quickly, demand increased steadily, but supply chains were still weak. This caused cost push inflation, where prices increased due to higher production and transport costs. In addition, the Russia-Ukraine war caused energy and food prices to rise further. For example, Thailand experienced inflation of about 6.1%, mainly due to high dependence on imported energy. This shows how global shocks can significantly affect Asian economies. Next is the break normalization period from 2024 to 2005. During this phase, economies became more stable, governments reduced subsidies, and central banks increased interest rates. As a result, inflation increased to around 2.2% to 2.9%. However, some countries like Malaysia still use the subsidies to control prices, creating what's known as artificial stability. While effective in the short term, this approach may not be sustainable in the long run. The third wave is the 2026 supply shock rebound. After inflation decreased in 2025, it suddenly increased again in 2026. This is known as the hook effect. This was caused by geopolitical conflicts, oil supply disruptions, and rising global energy costs. Oil prices reached about $95 per barrel, increasing costs across Asian countries. This demonstrates how sensitive Asian economies are to global changes. Based on these trends, there are three important areas of analysis. First, artificial versus market value inflation. Second, climate inflation for food security. And lastly, purchasing power crisis. Analysis 1. Artificial versus market-driven inflation. First, we compare Malaysia and Kenya. For Malaysia, inflation was around 2.2%. They used subsidies to control prices and provide short-term relief but increases government spending. For Vietnam, inflation was around 2.8%. Prices follow market prices and more transparent but less controlled. This shows that subsidies delay inflation but do not solve the root. Next is climate inflation, which is caused by environmental factors. Climate inflation refers to price increases due to climate and environmental problems, such as land supply. Between 2025 and 2026, El Nino environmental cost extremely low, which is 4 failures per bird, such as rice and corn, and food production decreased significantly. Since food accounts for about 30 to 40% of spending, prices increase quickly. Importantly, interest rates can solve this problem. Higher rates makes borrowing harder for farmers, and this may worsen food production. Therefore, solution must focus on climate resilient agriculture, better irrigation and infrastructure, and diversifying food supply sources. The final analysis is the purchasing power prices. Many people believe that lower inflation means lower prices, but this is not true. Due to price services, prices do not fall back after rising and they remain at a higher level. For example, inflation dropped from 6% to 3.5%, but actual prices are still high. At the same time, wages do not decrease at the same rate, and the value of money decreases over time. For example, $100 in 2021 is worth about $85 in 2026, showing around 15% loss in purchasing power. This creates a serious cost of living problem, especially for essential goods like food, housing, and transport. In conclusion, Asia has experienced three major inflation trends. Inflation is influenced by global, environmental, and domestic factors. The biggest impacts on people's purchasing power and cost of living. To address inflation effectively, governments must strengthen supply chains, invest in agriculture, reduce support payments, and focus on long-term structural reforms. Ultimately, managing inflation is not only about controlling numbers, but about improving people's quality of life. Thank you.
Okay, next slide. Issue and data ASEAN country. Okay, based on the latest data 2024 until 2025 estimates, Malaysia and Thailand have the lowest infection rates, indicating stable price conditions. However, Indonesia maintains moderate inflations within its target range. Next, Philippines records the highest inflations among the ASEAN, while Vietnam's inflation is relatively high but still can control. Overall, inflation remains manageable across the region, reflecting generally stable economic conditions. Okay, we go one by one. Five ASEAN. First, Malaysia. Malaysia record a lower inflation rate than many ASEAN countries, mainly because of fuel subsidies and price control on essential goods. These measures helps keep basic price stable. However, the low inflation figure that does not tell the whole story. Costs for housings, healthcare, education, and dining out continue to rise, placing financial pressure on households, especially middle and lower income groups. Therefore, while official inflation remains low, many Malaysians still face increased living costs in their daily life. Okay, next, Indonesia. Inflation is largely driven by foods and fuel price, which account for a significant share of household spending. Rising price of staple foods such as rice and vegetables directly increase living costs. At the same time, higher fuel price raise transportation and business costs, leading to border price increase across the economy. Government fuel subsidy policy and global oil price fluctuations also play an important role. Therefore, ensuring stability in the food and energy sectors is essential for controlling inflation and strengthening Indonesia's economic resilience. Okay, let we move to the next slide. Uh, the Philippines. The Philippines records the highest inflations among the ASEAN country, mainly due to the food-related factors. Food supply shortages, especially for rice, vegetables, and meat, can quickly drive up price. Frequent natural disasters such as typhoon and floods further reduce food supply by damaging crops and transportation networks. In addition, depends on imported foods means that higher global price and currency depreciation can increase costs. This is because foods represents a large share of household spending. Rising food prices have a significant impact on people's daily life and contribute strongly to overall inflation. Okay, fourth ASEAN country is Thailand. Thailand has one of the lowest inflation rates in the ASEAN, meaning the price of goods and service are relatively stable. However, this low inflation is often linked to weak consumer demand as people are spending less due to factors such as low income growth, high household debt, and economic uncertainty. Lower spending reduce business profits and may discourage investment and hiring. Therefore, while low inflation helps keeps price stable, it can also be sign of slower economic growth and limited job opportunities. Okay, and the last one, um, Vietnam. Vietnam maintains moderate and stable inflation because of its strong manufacturing sectors, which produce a large supply of goods and helps keep price under control. Manufacturing also supports employment and export, contributing to economic growth. However, as the economy continue to grow rapidly, higher incomes may increase consumer spending, while rising wages, material, transportation, and housing costs may put upward pressure on price. Therefore, although inflation is stable today, Vietnam may face higher inflation in the future if demand and costs continue to rise.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Muhammad Ikram Haikal bin Aznan. Now I will continue for the case study. For the first case study, I will discuss Malaysia. Malaysia experienced a moderate inflation rate after the COVID-19 pandemic. The inflation rate peaked at approximately 3.3% in 2022, which was lower than many other ASEAN countries. There were several main causes of inflation in Malaysia. Firstly, the increase in food price due to global supply chain disruption. Secondly, transportation and logistic costs increased because of higher fuel price. In addition, the depreciation of the Malaysian ringgit causes imported goods to become more expensive, leading to imported inflation. To control inflation, the Malaysian government introduced fuel and food subsidy as well as price control on essential goods. At the same time, Bank Negara Malaysia gradually increased the overnight policy rate or OPR to reduce inflationary pressure. Overall, Malaysia managed inflation quite effectively through a combination of government subsidy and monetary policy, allowing the country to maintain one of the lowest inflation rate in ASEAN. Now let's discuss Indonesia. Indonesia recorded an inflation rate of approximately 5.5% in 2022. The biggest contributor was the government's fuel subsidy reform, which increased fuel price and transportation costs across the economy. Food inflation also became a challenge due to climate-related disruption affecting agriculture production. To address this issue, Bank Indonesia increased interest rate while the government established a regional inflation control team to monitor food price and improve supply distribution. As a result, inflation gradually returned to the government target range by 2024. This case showed that strong cooperation between the government and the central bank is very important in managing inflation effectively. Next, let's look at Philippines. Compared to Malaysia, the Philippines experienced one of the highest inflation rate in ASEAN, with inflation exceeding 6% in 2023. The main reason was the sharp increase in food price, especially rice, which is the country's staple food. Besides that, higher fuel price depend on imported goods and natural disasters such as typhoons, disrupted agriculture production and reduced food supply. To manage inflation, the Bangko Sentral and the Philippines increased interest rates several times to reduce inflationary pressure. The government also lowered import tariff and food product to increase domestic supply. From this case, we can conclude that food security play a very important role in controlling inflation because shortage in essential goods can significantly increase the cost of living. Moving on to Thailand. Thailand inflation rate reached around 6.1% in 2022, mainly due to rising global energy price. Since Thailand import a large amount of energy, higher oil price increased transportation and production costs. Another factor was the recovery of the tourism industry after the pandemic. As more tourists return, demand for hotel, restaurant and transportation increased, which also contribute to inflation. To reduce inflation, the Bank of Thailand gradually increased interest rate while the government introduced measures to reduce the burden of rising energy costs on households. Although Thailand experienced high inflation initially, its strong agriculture sector helped stabilize food price, allowing inflation to decline in the following year. Finally, we have Vietnam. Vietnam maintained one of the most stable inflation rate in ASEAN, with inflation remaining around 3 to 4% despite global economic uncertainty. This was mainly because Vietnam has a strong agriculture sector ensuring a stable food supply. At the same time, the country continued to attract foreign investment and achieve strong export growth, which strengthened its economy. The government also monitored price of exchange a good closely while the State Bank of Vietnam implement a stable monetary policy to maintain price stability. Overall, Vietnam demonstrated that strong agriculture production, export competitive and effective government policy can successfully keep inflation under control.
In conclusion, this comparison of Malaysian, Thailand, Indonesian, Philippines, and Vietnam demonstrate that inflation within ASEAN is driven by structural differences rather than a single macroeconomic strand. While the global manufacturing and technologies boom has supported economic growth across these regions, it has simultaneously exposed how vulnerable these distinct nations remain to external supply shocks. To fully understand this divergence, it's clear that the pandemic had left a permanent mark on Asia's current inflationary landscape. The massive cash injection from emergency stimulus package significantly increased liquidity in the banking system, while long-term factory closure created supply shortage that could not keep up when the economy suddenly reopened. The persistent imbalance between the high consumer liquidity and damaged supply chains remain a primary root cause of the structural cost-push inflations observed across the region today. Consequently, these varying rates of inflation creates high-fraction consumer landscape within ASEAN. In high-inflation countries like Philippines, inflation acts as an invisible tax that disproportionately punishes the poor, severely eroding domestic purchasing power and stalling the long-term human capital development. Conversely, in subsidized economies like Malaysian, consumer spending is temporarily sustained through heavy fiscal interventions. However, this creates an underlying state of consumer vulnerability, where impending fiscal reform and subsidy rationalization threaten to trigger delayed price shock of the middle and lower income classes. Ultimately, the wide gap between Malaysian subsidized 1.7% inflation and the Philippine supply-driven 6.8% rates prove that a single uniform economic policy cannot work for the entire regions. Low inflation countries must now focus on long-term fiscal sustainability by systematically shifting towards target subsidized, while higher inflation nations must carefully balance domestic market monetary tightening with the external currency stabilizations. For the Asian Economic Community (AEC), To maintain stable, resilient growth, member states must move beyond short-term interest rates adjustments and actively collaborate on regional food security, agriculture resilience, and integrated energy grids.